All right, thank you, Andrea. And I am also curious if you would raise your hand on there as well. I'm wondering how many of you attended any of the other webinars that we've done over the last couple weeks. I'm anticipating that maybe there are several of you who sat in either on the ITERS or the ECERS webinar, but I would like to know that. So, Andrea, will you let me know what you see?
Let's see. Ooh, a lot.
Oh, good. Okay.
Probably 10 people, and so almost half.
Almost 50%. Great.
Yeah.
I was hoping that most of you who attended this evening would have a pretty good foundational understanding of at least one of the rating scales, and I'm going to assume from the poll questions and from that we're going to be fine with that. This is a picture of me doing my first skydive, and I have done 72 of them, which probably sounds like a lot, but it really isn't very many. Both of those instructors there, that's Michael and that's Victor, they both have like 10,000, so it made me look like a newbie forever. But I often think that going through formal rating, or really any of these experiences with Youngstar when you do it the first time, is a lot like doing that first skydive. You get a little bit of training, not nearly enough probably, but most of what you're doing you just have to do on faith, and you just have to step out and do it, and it's going to be okay. I'm here to tell you that I landed all of those times, never broke a bone or anything. And so if you can sort of apply that same mentality to the experiences that you have with Youngstar and formal rating, you're going to be fine. You're going to learn a lot, and it will be a positive experience. First of all, I just want to review some of the information and resources that we use when we score the rating scales. So for ITERS and ECERS, which are the only two that I'm anticipating mentioning at all this evening, there's the All About the ECERS and the All About the ITERS. We also use the additional notes for clarification, which we update once a year. Updated versions of those go out January 1st each year for that calendar year. And those additional notes for clarification are available from your technical consultant or on the Youngstar website. If you click on the page for providers, you should navigate through. It might take you a minute, but if you navigate through there, you will find those notes for clarification. You will also find the Wisconsin interpretations on that site, or those would be available from your technical consultant as well. And then we also use the CPSC Public Playground Safety Handbook for evaluating the safety and the quality of the gross motor play equipment that we typically see outdoors. So those are the resources we use. Those are all available to you one way or another, and I would encourage you to access them and become very familiar with them, because they will be extremely helpful through the process. Okay, so here's just a very basic data point for you, that ITERS has a total of 32 items in 6 subscales that we score for Youngstar, and ECERS has a total of 37 items in the same 6 subscales. So I've made some charts here, some tables that, to compare this, and the items in red are things that are different enough. You'll see even from the titles that although they're basically the same thing, there's some difference even in how some of these things are titled. And then of course if you're looking at both of the rating scales, you would see that the indicators, some of the indicators are different. But as a general rule, if it's in red on these tables, it's enough different that we're going to talk about it tonight with some more attention to it. So here for space and furnishings, both score indoor space, furniture for routine care, provision for relaxation and comfort, room arrangement, and then child-related display. ECERS only, between the two, has a requirement for a space for privacy, space for gross motor play, and gross motor equipment. The space for gross motor play and the gross motor equipment in ECERS is the equivalent of item number 16, which is active physical play, part of it in ITERS. And so you'll see that highlighted in red when we get to that. Here's the personal care routine subscale, and check this out. It's the same for the most part. When you read the indicators, there are some minor differences, but for the most part, we're scoring the same things through this whole subscale. So I think that for me as a rater, one of the most significant differences is that on the score sheets, we do not have the diaper changing procedure on the ECERS score sheet, even though we see it regularly. We just have to know it for scoring it, but it is actually printed out on the score sheet for ITERS. And you'll notice it's listed first there because it's obviously more prevalent in an ITERS room than in a room that's bridging that gap, you know, that mixed age group from 2 to 3. Okay, here in the ITERS, this subscale is called listening and talking. In ECERS, it's called language and reasoning. And for the most part, they both have a books item. And then in ITERS, helping children understand language and helping children use language, the indicators are very, very straightforward. And it's all about talking to the children and responding to them when they talk to you. They are very similar, those two items, to encouraging children to communicate and the informal use of language in ECERS. So I didn't highlight any of those because if you're talking to the kids and you're listening to them when they talk back to you, regardless of which rating scale you're using, those are going to probably score about the same. But you'll notice that here in the ECERS, using language to develop reasoning skills, this is substantially different. And it's only in ECERS, and so we will talk about that in more detail later on this evening. Here are the activities, and you'll notice that the actual activity items are for the most part the same. There's that active physical play that I mentioned that is scored in ITERS, and there is no equivalent item or specific one item like that in ECERS, but that is covered by the gross motor play, space, and equipment, and then also supervision. So we'll see that there. Otherwise, you'll notice here that math and number is scored in ECERS, and it is not scored in ITERS at all. There's not a requirement for those materials. When we go through here, I'll let you know how you can make sure that you have those materials. We're going to go through each of these activity areas specifically this evening so that I can help you understand how you can have a developmentally appropriate classroom for children who might be 2 to 2.5 while meeting all of the requirements for children who might be 2.5 to 3, so that if at the beginning of the school year or program year, maybe you have an ITERS room because the children in the room are young, over the course of the year, as those children get older, eventually in a mixed age group room, it's going to transition to an ECERS room, usually. So I'm going to help you know how you can have materials that meet the requirements of both in these areas. In interactions, you'll see that there is an additional item here, supervision of gross motor activities for ECERS. There is not an equivalent one for ITERS because the supervision of gross motor play is part of supervision of play and learning and also part of that active physical play item. Otherwise, these are basically the same. You're looking at peer interaction or interactions among children, staff-child interactions, discipline, and then the only other thing, and I'll mention this again later, is that in ECERS, general supervision of children, other than gross motor, is all supervision of children, and it does include routine care times. In ITERS, the supervision of play and learning does not consider supervision of routine care times. That supervision for each of those, meals and nap and diapering, all of those, is only scored in the actual personal care routine item for that. But in ECERS, the supervision of those routine care times is scored in the personal care item specifically, and it's scored here, so you want to be aware of that. Then the program structure subscale is basically the same. Very minor differences. I would say that the biggest difference is that in ITERS it's possible to score group play activities NA because they're not required. In ECERS that is not an option. It has to be scored. So I think I've built in a question slide right here. So does anybody have a question now for me? I'm assuming from that.
I guess not.
Okay.
Nothing yet.
Okay, well that's good. Then we'll just get right into the meat of this, the specifics of each of these things that are different. And since so many of you attended some of the other webinars or have a fair amount of familiarity with these rating scales, I'm literally just focusing on the things that I think have significant differences. If you have questions, about something that you maybe have a little awareness of but I'm not covering, please send those to Andrea and we will definitely address all the questions that come through. So we'll get started here with the first item that's different, and that is in the space and furnishing subscale. If you recall, I said right away that space for privacy is required in ECERS and that there was no requirement for that in ITERS. And so these are the highlights for the space for privacy. First of all, I want to mention that one of the things that is required in both is furnishings for relaxation. And in furnishings for relaxation in ITERS, there is a requirement for a cozy area. A cozy area very, very easily can meet the requirement of space for privacy. So if you have a cozy area in your ITERS room, in your 2-year-old room, you don't have to worry about adding another space for privacy. All you need to do is make sure that these requirements are met for that. That it's easily supervised, whether it's an indoor space or an outdoor space. That it's a space set aside for 1 to 2 children. And it's protected from intrusion by others. So a cozy area in an ITERS room, oftentimes there aren't limits put on the number of children who can be in an area in an ITERS room, but you would want to be specific if you're making that transition that this would be a space for only 1 to 2 children, and I think that a cozy area, that sort of goes without saying. And also you would want to make sure that it's protected from intrusion by other children, but that's also similar to the ITERS indicator that refers to protecting the cozy area from active play. So if you do that, it's basically going to meet this requirement as well. And then the other thing would be at a very high level, at the 7 level for space for privacy, would be that you as a staff person or teacher would set up activities for 1 to 2 children in a private space away from general group activities. And this can be done by having a small table off to the side or in a corner of the room where maybe you put 1 or 2 puzzles and you only allow 1 or 2 children there. It could be your art area or a drawing table. It could be the easel. If you set that off to the side and only allow 1 children to color with chalk on it or paint at a time, that's another way to do this. So most of the time you already have those spaces in your classroom. It's just a matter of looking at them from this angle, and we do that. We count a cozy area as a space for privacy all of the time. Next, also in space and furnishings, are these 2 items in ECERS, space for gross motor play and gross motor equipment. The space and the gross motor equipment in an ITERS room are considered both in safety, if there's safety hazards related to either the space or the equipment, and they are considered in that active physical play item. So this just breaks it out and makes it into 2 separate items, but it really addresses the same things, the safety of both the space and the equipment, appropriateness of the equipment, and other things that are the same in both rating scales. How easy is it for the kids to get to the space, so the accessibility of it. Do they have different surfaces, a hard surface and a soft surface? Is there some protection from the elements? Those kind of things are consistent across both of the rating scales. So one thing that we do look for, well, we look for it in both ITERS and ECERS, but it's itemized again in ECERS, is that you want to have both indoor and outdoor gross motor play spaces. Don't get stressed and think you have to have an indoor gross motor play room. That's not a requirement. There just needs to be enough room in your classroom, for instance, if you move the tables off to the side or something, for children to engage in some gross motor play, like using a parachute in the classroom with some little balls or something. That's appropriate, and if you have the space to do that in your classroom, then that would get credit. The space for gross motor play, like I mentioned here, considers the safety hazards of the space only. It doesn't look at safety hazards of the equipment. So it's possible to have a low score in the space for gross motor play because maybe you have insufficient cushioning or insufficient fall space, and still get a high score for gross motor equipment because maybe all of the equipment is appropriate and you're using enough of it so children don't have to wait to take their turn, and it presents enough challenge for the children to develop different skills. So that's actually a benefit to having these broken out into two things, because it allows you to get credit. Most programs, I would say, score pretty high on gross motor equipment, even if they have a score of only 1 or 2 for the safety of the actual play space. So that's not a bad thing. Next we go to using language to develop reasoning skills. This is the one item in the language and reasoning subscale in ECERS that there is not a similar item in the listening and talking subscale in ITERS. So this one has a significant impact on score because it's not uncommon for it to score low. So what you need to know about this is that this is very, very specifically looking for staff to be talking about logical relationships and concepts, or things that help the children to learn about things like sequencing, size, quantity, same and different, things like that. So we're listening very specifically for language where you as the staff are talking to the children about these things, like saying, you know, we're going to go outside after we have snack this morning. That's something about using a very concrete example in a real world situation for the kids that helps them learn about sequencing of events. And we look for examples that are concrete and just real-world experiences, but then also we're looking for you to be talking about those relationships while the children are playing with materials that stimulate reasoning. And so those materials might be things like pegs in a pegboard, and you're talking about how many pegs there are in one row and how many in another. Maybe they're lining up 2 yellow pegs here and 3 green pegs next to it and comparing that. This is one more. That's a logical thing, and that's a material that is designed for that kind of learning. And then, so one of them is that you talk about it. The other one there, and these are both indicators, the staff talk about logical relationships and then encouraging children to talk through or explain their reasoning. These are the 2 indicators at the 5 level in this item. And often we see that this item scores a 3 or a 4 because these are not met. So there's that one where you talk about a logical relationship while children are playing with the materials, and the next one is where you encourage the children to talk through or explain their reasoning when solving problems. So that's where you have to ask questions. It's not just about you explaining a concept, it's also about you encouraging the kids to think like that. I just happen to have a score sheet with me. I didn't even plan this really, but I just did an observation yesterday, and I'm going to give you some of the examples of this kind of language that I heard in that observation. And these are examples, some with materials and some that are just about, you know, children developing logical conclusions based on information. So one time the teacher said, we can't all talk at one time or no one will be heard. That's a very logical thing. It gets credit here. It gets credit at the 3 level. It also gets credit at 5.1. This teacher had a conversation during group time with the children about they have a classroom fish and what does the fish need to survive and be healthy. And so the children said the fish needs food and water and light and those kinds of things. Another time she was talking about having wet hands before they played in the sand and what will happen if you have wet hands and you put your hands in the sand. And then the children were responding that the sand would stick to their hands. Another time a child was trying to get something out of a play material off of a shelf or something and it wasn't coming out, and the teacher said pull on the corner because it's stuck. That's another example. A child talked about how she was painting and she got paint on the table. It was not on the paper and she was concerned about it on the table, so the teacher explained that after they were all finished painting they were going to clean it up and the paint would be gone. So those are all examples, but here's that don't involve necessarily materials that stimulate reasoning, but here was a really good conversation. A child was building a tower with blocks and had a small block underneath a large block and it fell over, and so the teacher asked what makes it fall down. And the child didn't know, so the teacher said maybe because this one is smaller, what if you put it the other way? And that was a great example of her using a material and a very specific situation that involved the child and having the child see what changing that action did. And then another time, the blocks fell down and the teacher asked how come that happened. This was with a different child, and the child answered. So those are examples that we're looking for here. Yesterday, this observation where I heard all of those, this scored a 7 because the teacher used a lot of language, and she used this language during play experiences, during group time, using materials. Those are really good examples, and so I want you to think about that and get in the habit of talking about those logical relationships. And then I also want to highlight here that each indicator, these indicators throughout this whole item, require that we have to observe them 1 to 2 times each. This one, staff talking about logical relationships, this is indicator 5.1, we have to observe that once. But all of the other indicators at the 3 level, indicator 5.2, and the 2 at the 7 level, all must be observed 2 times. So what I guess I want to encourage is that you talk a lot in the classroom with the kids and that you ask a lot of questions, open-ended questions, really draw out answers from the kids. And I know that that's harder when you have a young 2-year-old group because they're not even using as much language, but they will start to use more if you use more. So this one's a challenging one, but I've seen it done well. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, here we are then, we're going to get into the activities subscale. And I think that this whole subscale is probably the one that makes people the most nervous about the difference or transitioning from an ITERS environment to ECERS. Because in ITERS the language is, that there are many and varied materials, fine motor materials. But in ECERS they say, well, you have to have these categories. And so it seems like, geez, we have to have so many more materials. You really don't. If you have an ITERS room at the beginning of the program year, and you're scoring at the 5 level for this item, fine motor, the requirement at 5.1 is that you have many and varied materials for the group of children. And for toddlers, which is obviously the age that you have if you're transitioning, the requirement is that you have 15 different materials, items, for a group of 5 and 1 additional for each child thereafter. So for a group of 8 children, which might be your group size, you would be required to have 18 different materials to meet that requirement. Well, 18 different materials can very easily be divided into those 4 categories you see here. And these are the categories that are broken up in ECERS: small building toys, art materials, manipulatives, and puzzles. And the many and varied, which is also 5.1 in ECERS, requires 3 to 5 of each type. Well, 3 of each of these is 12 materials, and that same minimal requirement is 18 in ITERS. So you're already supposed to have more materials. So what you really need to know is how do you take those 18 materials that you already have to have, those 18 different items, and make sure that you have some of each of these. And so here's what I would throw out to you, that with small building toys, some of the things that meet that requirement would be things like Duplos or Mega Blocks, the large ones that are appropriate for 2- and 3-year-old children. Waffle blocks, bristle blocks. There are some larger connecting blocks that are similar, like to Lincoln Logs, or I think there might even be a version of Tinker Toys. But those are things that are building materials that are appropriate for young 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and would meet that requirement. Art materials, I think art gets a little bit trickier because a lot of art materials are not always developmentally appropriate for young 2-year-olds, but you can still do this. You could have things like crayons. You could have sidewalk chalk. You could have Play-Doh, and you could have paint, like tempera paint with large paint brushes. So as long as you have 3 different things, and that can be done with crayons and paper, Play-Doh, and painting, then you've met the minimal requirement there. Manipulatives would be things like pegs and a pegboard, and there are large versions of those for, toddlers. Shape sorters. lacing cards, stringing beads, those are examples of manipulatives. The wonderful thing about those manipulatives as well is that they also will be counted as math materials. A shape sorter is a math material, pegs and pegboards. Stacking rings, I've seen those in, you know, young 2-year-old classrooms, and those are a manipulative, and because they are a shape and a size difference thing, that's a math material as well. So you can have items like that that will round out your manipulatives category. And then there are lots of puzzles that are 1 or 2 or 3 pieces that have little peg handles on them that are very appropriate for young 2-year-olds. Maybe you go up to 4-piece puzzles, you know, with animals or shapes or numbers or letters. Probably not letters, that's a lot of pieces. But anyway, that's the way that you can take those 18 materials that would be required for that ITERS group at the beginning of your program year, and just make sure that the 18 materials you choose are things that also meet those requirements, and you're going to be fine. It's not going to matter if you have an ITERS rater or an ECERS rater come in and do it. It would meet the requirement in both. The big difference then, aside from that, is the difference between much of the day in ITERS and substantial portion of the day in ECERS. And both refer to the amount of time that children have access to the materials to use them freely and the way that they want to, as long as it's appropriate and safe. And substantial portion of the day is easier to achieve than much of the day. So moving from ITERS to ECERS and being finished with much of the day is should be a relief to you. It's much easier to score past much of the day. The next category then in activities is art. And my opinion as a rater is that this is the toughest one for bridging the gap, because as you see, there are 5 different categories here in ECERS, and the many and varied requirement is for 3 to 5 from 4 of those types, and drawing materials is required. So this is harder because it's hard. I understand it's a challenge to find and be sure that all of your art materials are appropriate for children under the age of 3. It's very easy to have materials and then find out later that they're not appropriate, they're labeled not for use by children younger than 3, or parts of them are choking hazards or whatever. So looking at this, some examples, again, if you're going to do the minimum for many and varied, it's 3 out of at least 4 of these types. So for drawing materials, 3 things would be crayons, chalk, and there's chunky chalk, and markers. And bear in mind that if you're bridging the gap, those ages there, that the marker caps are choking hazards for children under 3, but if you make the caps inaccessible, the markers are totally appropriate. So there's 3 things there to use with paper for drawing materials. Paints could be tempera paints, there's large watercolors, there's also paints like in squeeze bottles that are maybe like liquid watercolors. If they have a different label on them on the original container, I give credit for them for actually being a different type of paint, even if it really sort of functions the same. So you could find 3 types of paints. 3D materials, I mentioned earlier Play-Doh, and that's sort of a no-brainer. I often see, I believe it's called Floam. It's like little, it feels kind of like little tiny styrofoam balls that are a little bit sticky. That's very appropriate for kids, you know, to use here, and it's a 3D art material. Also, egg cartons are easy and safe, and paper tubes. Those are 3D materials. Collage materials can include string, like little pieces of yarn, paper scraps. Do not include anything here that would be choking hazards, like wiggly eyes or pom-poms, buttons, beads, you know, those small things that could pose those kind of problems. But you can still use stickers and paper scraps. I see a lot of times like wallpaper scraps, felt, little fabric scraps, little small pieces of ribbon, you know, like 1-inch lengths of ribbon or yarn. Those are all collage materials. And then tools. Tools can be the Play-Doh tools that you use. It can be the paint brushes that you use with paints. It can be stamps and stamp pads. Scissors that are age appropriate, glue sticks, bingo markers or bingo daubers. They're called a variety of different things, but those are considered tools, and I see those often in very young preschool classrooms. So with the examples that I just gave you, I'm confident if you plan right, plan well, that you can meet the requirements for materials. I think your next challenge is that if you have had an ITERS room, although you've been doing art activities, it has not been a requirement that those materials be accessible to the children every day for a certain amount of time. In an ECERS room, the appropriate materials must be accessible for a substantial portion of the day to score at the 5 level. So, making sure that first of all the materials are appropriate, and second of all that they're accessible, that's a bigger challenge, because sometimes young 2-year-olds and even older 2-year-olds are not very good about not painting on the walls or coloring on the walls or on the table or whatever. But it's occasionally a program has to make a decision to accept a lower score in something because it just works better for them. And as an example, I did an observation of a program in Jefferson County, and they chose to not ever have art materials accessible to the children in their classroom. It was a young preschool room. And that was just a choice they made. Their score in art was a 2, and they were aware of that even before I came in. They knew that that was going to be the score, and they said it doesn't matter. That's what works for us. It's too stressful to us to have the kids have all those materials accessible. So we're fine with this. And I thought that that was a very good attitude. It's good to know what your own limits are as a teacher, as a center director, whatever, and just accept the score if you are willing to accept that. Otherwise, you might have to be creative with art for how to make those materials accessible as appropriate for a substantial portion of the day. So we have a time here built in for some questions if anybody has any.
So can you leave scissors out of a 2-year-old room with both ITERS and ECERS scoring? Did I read that right? Can you leave scissors out of a 2-year-old room with both ITERS and ECERS scoring?
You can, and I see them out all the time in ECERS rooms. I never really see them out in ITERS rooms because it's not required in ITERS. There's not a requirement that art materials be freely accessible to children. So I very rarely in an ITERS room, even one of these rooms that's changing from ITERS to ECERS during the year, see those materials out. And you don't have to leave scissors out. I mean, there's lots of other tools that maybe you would want to leave out. But if you have, there are several different brands of child appropriate and very young child appropriate safety scissors that I don't think you have to worry about at all, that I do not ever cite as a safety hazard. And I see those out in young preschool rooms, and yes, that's fine. But remember that you don't have to.
Jennifer's clarifying, can we not have scissors? So I think she means, can they not have them available?
Yes, that's totally acceptable. That's one of the nice things about the environment rating scales when they say, you have to have 3 to 5 materials of 4 of those categories, but they don't say scissors has to be one of them. So in the tools category, I mean, you can have rulers and stencils and stamps and stamp pads and paintbrushes and paint cups and Play-Doh tools, and those are all kinds of tools, and none of them is scissors. So
I think Jennifer's suggesting they may have had a hair cutting issue.
Oh, well, I did that myself.
They still cut hair. Yeah, fairly common. Okay, so another question. We have a stand with the marker cap built into them. Would that work for children under 3?
I have seen that work very well. Make sure that the caps cannot come off. Sometimes they get loose. It depends on how they're attached. But yes, if you have one of those boards where you either glue them in with like crazy glue or one of the super glue, or I've seen it where they're attached with some, they're fixed in there some other way. As long as they're not loose and the child can't get them, that's totally fine. Any other questions?
That's it for now, looks like.
Okay, well then we're going to move on. Oops. Okay, so the next activity area in ECERS, and these get a little bit out of order. Remember, they're the same items, but the order, if you're looking at an ITERS book, is going to be a little bit different because I took this from the ECERS. So it's music materials. And in ITERS, there's just a requirement that they have many musical items and toys, and that can include things like musical toys that you push a button and it plays music. those are less likely to be credited as a musical instrument in ECERS. So in ECERS we generally see more musical instruments, bells, triangles, blocks, sticks, cymbals, drums, tambourines, you know, all of those kind of things. There's also a requirement for music for the kids to listen to. And in a young preschool classroom, so maybe a group of children who is transitioning from an ITERS room to an ECERS room, they do not have, there's not a requirement that they be able to use the CD player. That is a requirement if all the children are 4 years or older in the room, but that's not the case in these rooms. So it would just be having a tape player or a CD player or something with music that you can put on and play. A wonderful thing for ECERS is that there is not that indicator that says that recorded music is used at limited times and with a positive purpose where you can't play music for longer than 20 minutes. That is not even considered at all in ECERS. So you can actually play music for longer, and if you end up forgetting to turn it on and it stays on for 45 minutes, that is not going to impact your score. So and then there's also a category of dance props. So dance props are not required to be present, but if they are present, it is required that there either be musical instruments or music to listen to so that there's something to use with them. And so you just want to have enough musical materials for the children to be, you know, busy with them, and that they don't have to compete over them. And then the other thing that's a little bit different is that these have to be available during free play and group experiences during the day. So if you only do group music, that would get scored off, but that's at the 7 level, so it's not hugely significant. So that's scoring music. Next is blocks. In ITERS, there's a requirement at the 3 level, there's 2 types of blocks, or no, 1 type of block. At the 5 level, it's 2 types, and at the 7 level, it's 3 types. There is not that requirement at ECERS. There's just a requirement that there's enough blocks. They could all be the same type if you wanted them to be. Usually we see 2 or 3 different types. But to score at the 5 level, you need to have enough space, enough blocks, and enough accessories for 3 children to build at the same time. Usually the issue that we see that makes this not score above that is that there's not enough space. There's usually plenty of blocks and accessories, but the space for 3 children to build at the same time requires a fair amount of space. There is also a requirement in blocks in ECERS at a high level that the shelves be labeled, and that they be labeled with the symbols of the blocks or a photo of the blocks, not just with a word. And then we also look at whether or not outdoor block play is available. As far as blocks themselves, it's the same requirement for what is a block. A block is, you know, a block that measures more than 2 inches on a majority of the sides. So if you just think standard size unit blocks, there's foam unit blocks that are the same size, there's those cardboard bricks, you know, those are all blocks that meet these requirements. And if you are going to have block play outdoors, it has to be blocks that meet the requirements, not some other kind of block like mega blocks. Okay. Sand and water. In ITERS, this is often scored NA in very young toddler classrooms or infant classrooms because, you know, this isn't required for children under 18 months. It is a requirement in ECERS, but we don't look at supervision, which is usually the problem in the ITERS. It's indicator 3.2 in ITERS has careful supervision of this, and we actually don't score supervision right in this item for ECERS, so that actually helps. It still gets factored into the supervision score, but not also in this item score. So the requirement here is that at the 5 level that you have sand and or water available indoors and or outdoors. It doesn't require it in both places, and it doesn't require both of them, but they need to have some sensory play experience either inside or outside. And it has to be available at least 1 hour a day. And then to score at the 7 level, there's the requirement that they have both sand and water, both indoors and outdoors, and they have to be separate provisions. You can't have one sensory table that you rotate materials through in the classroom where 1 week we have water in it, 1 week we have sand in it. And when we want to have water play outside, we push that same table outside for water play, and there's a sandbox outside. That would not get credit at indicator 7.1 because 7.1 is looking for 2 separate provisions indoors and 2 separate provisions outdoors. So that's a difference too from ITERS. But again, that's scoring very high at 7.1. And like I already mentioned, these need to be available for at least 1 hour daily, or one of them does, to score at the 5 level. Dramatic play. I don't think that this is substantially different from ITERS and ECERS. There's still, you know, in ITERS you're required to have dolls and play furniture and dishes and pots and pans and play food and those kinds of things. And so we look for similar things in ECERS, except that now we call them themes. So a theme would be housekeeping, and housekeeping is things like the little kitchen set with the dishes and pots and pans and silverware. Work as a theme could be having a doctor kit or construction hats and tools, or I've seen like a scientist where they have a little microscope and, you know, different things like that. So those are themes. And so we don't look for the specific breakout of the materials so much as we're just looking to have these themes present. And I do want to mention that there is the requirement for dress-up clothes. They are required in ECERS, but I mean, you probably already have those. I don't generally see dramatic play centers that do not have dress-up clothes. Another requirement is that the dramatic play area be clearly defined with space to play and organized storage. So if you have like a toy box or a bin or something and you're taking all of the dramatic play materials and throwing them in there together when you're cleaning up, that's not going to be considered organized storage. Having the dramatic play area be clearly defined means that it's evident by the way it's set up what the boundaries are. So although some children may take the baby doll and go across the room with it, you would direct the child back to the dramatic play area and it would be evident what that dramatic play area is. And I think that that's a concept that is not strongly enforced or reinforced in ITERS. So that would be new. It's really more about having an interest center. Another indicator here is that at the 7 level that pictures, stories, or trips are used to enrich dramatic play. And the requirement to get credit for this, you know, most programs use pictures and stories. That's not a problem. You know, they'll read a book about the 3 little pigs and then they'll maybe have props in their dramatic play center for a week or a month even that go along with that. That's not uncommon, but the trips are a bigger challenge because in order to get credit for this, trips have to be taken at least twice a year. And they have to be trips that specifically go along with the dramatic play. Usually when I see this done well, it's that they have a theme that they're doing and they plan the theme, you know, everything in the classroom is done around that theme. They have library books that go with that. They're doing science and math activities that go with that. A common one would be in the fall, maybe like an apple orchard or a pumpkin patch theme, where many of those items that go along with that are brought into the center and they're put in the science center, or brought into the classroom, I mean. And there's activities that go with them, and also I've seen, you know, like overalls and cowboy hats and things like that that are farm, like straw hats, like that farm kind of gear, put in the dramatic play center, and then taking a trip to the pumpkin patch. That's a very common field trip I see. So that's an example of that. But to get credit for that indicator, you would have to take at least 2 of those a year. That indicator's in the 7s, so if you don't do it, especially with a group of children that young, nobody would be surprised. The other thing I want to mention here is consider the safety hazards of some items for young children. And I think that I mentioned this earlier, but I do think that this is one of the biggest challenges, is that, you know, when you go to an ECERS room and you start putting these other materials in there, it's easy to forget that if you still have children under the age of 3 in the classroom, which most of these kids will be, You still need to make sure you're looking at tags on stuffed animals and make sure that it doesn't say not for use by children under 3 years of age. Look at boxes that puzzles and games come in and make sure that they're not labeled something. And in dramatic play, the things that are not uncommon to see that are safety hazards for kids under the age of 3 would be like purses with long straps. They could be strangulation hazards. Long neckties. I always recommend clip-on ties because anything longer than 12 inches is a strangulation hazard for children under 3. Boas and long scarves. So, you know, consider those things, and if they're not appropriate, don't put them in there, because not only will they be counted as a safety hazard, but they also will not get credit for an appropriate material. So
here's a question about dress-up. So we have dress-up clothes, tutus, dresses, suit coats that the children love to put on and ask for a dance party. So we put on dance music. Would the dress-up clothes be a music prop?
No. No, they're just dress-up clothes. They're dramatic play. Dance props are things like ribbon streamers or, why can I not think of, there's another one that's very common, but mostly it's like ribbon streamers, scarves. So if you're talking about scarves, but if they're putting on dress-up clothes and they're having a dance party, I would say that that's your theme, is a dance party, and these clothes, they're still dramatic play. They won't, but you're not required to have music props anyway, so that's okay.
A couple more questions. Let's see. So if I have materials in a cabinet but it's not locked, is that considered accessible?
Well, here's the thing about that. It's considered accessible if they're safety hazards and they're not locked, but they're not considered accessible if they're play materials that are stored in a cupboard and we don't see the kids go get them out. So it's an interesting distinction, and it's a good question. So I would say that if they're play materials that you intend the children to use, put them out in the room so that we can see that they're accessible, because we will be scoring a substantial portion of the day or much of the day, either one depending on the rating scale. But if they're safety hazards, keep them in the closet and lock the door.
And here's just a more general question about formal rating. So this will be our first formal rating. Is there a point during observation that would be an automatic fail, as in
No.
not reaching an average of 4?
No. The only thing that would stop the rating immediately is if you were violating licensing and specifically with ratios or something. But it would have to be, it can't just be that, geez, we're out of ratio because a child arrived 15 minutes early and the other staff person is down the hall in the lounge and she's not in here yet. It's not that kind of out of ratio. It's that, you know, the rater's there, there's a teacher there with 5 kids and 5 more show up, and there's no other teacher shows up, and the rater says, is anybody else scheduled? And she says, no, this is it. We do this every day. Well, then we would immediately stop the observation, and we would contact licensing and report that. But that's the only thing that I can think of, I mean, short of some, you know, very overt act that's inappropriate, some kind of abuse or something. But as far as the rating scales, no, I have not seen anything that that one thing is the total deal breaker for the observation.
Any more questions? Doesn't look like it, so.
Okay, I'll move on then. The next activity or interest center in ECERS is nature and science. This is scored in both of the rating scales, but in ITERS it's real easy for this to score a 7. It's much more challenging in ECERS. There are categories in ECERS, and they include collections of natural objects, living things, nature and science books, games, or toys, and nature science activities. So again, it's the same rule of thumb that many and varied is 3 to 5 from 3 of these 4 types. So collections of natural objects would be things like stones or feathers or pine cones or tree branches or seashells. I mean, there's lots of things like that. It could be, if you're doing a pumpkin patch theme, it could be some of those little pumpkin gourds if you have 5 of those, or 3 of those, obviously a collection is more than one. So if you just have one bird's nest, you won't get credit for a collection, but if you have 2 or 3, you would. Living things, this could be the class pet, which might be a fish, it might be some kind of mammal, although we rarely see that, like a rabbit or a gerbil or something. Usually it's fish. Could be houseplants. The one caveat I want to put out there about plants, and I say this all the time, I know other raters do too when we do trainings, make sure that you have checked to find out what kind of houseplants you have, if you have them in your room, because first of all, they will only be given credit for this section if they are appropriate, and appropriate means they have to be non-toxic. So that's one thing, and they have to be labeled. You need to find out what kind it is, you need to look it up to make sure it's non-toxic, and then you need to put the label on it so that everybody else knows what it is and that it's non-toxic. The other thing is if it's not labeled, or even if it is labeled, we were just in this program yesterday and they had a plant labeled and the plant is toxic, so just because it has a label on it doesn't mean it's still okay. So if they're not labeled and they're toxic, or if they are labeled and they're toxic, they're not going to get credit here, and they're going to be labeled as a safety hazard, and they'll be included in the list of safety hazards. So be very careful with living things. I would strongly recommend that you have houseplants in your classroom. That's a really easy thing to meet the requirement of living things. Have 2 or 3 of them. That's great. But make sure that they're safe and appropriate, and make sure they're labeled. Nature and science books, games, and toys. This is pretty easy to meet the requirements for this as well. You know, you can have lots and lots of books about the weather, about animals, about colors. Those are some very typical and appropriate concepts for young children who are 2. Games or toys, I often see like realistic toy animals that are included maybe in your block center as accessories. Those get credit here. Any kind of matching game or lotto game where you're matching maybe a baby animal with a mother or an animal with the kind of home it lives in, whatever, those would be games here. Those might also count as activities. They can only count in one place or the other, but usually activities are things like color paddles, so they can change the colors of things, maybe flashlights with colored lenses, bug catchers and little nets, and you know, the little like a little basket or something you keep the bug in. Those I see a lot. And magnifying glasses, magnets, those are all things that you can find to keep, you know, to have in these this part of your Nature and Science Center that are appropriate as well. The other thing that is different and isn't considered at all in ITERS is this idea that children are encouraged to bring in natural things to share. This scores at the 3 level in ECERS, so it's pretty important. So even with a young 2-year-old classroom, you would want to be encouraging families or, you know, kids, maybe you have a show and tell time or some kind of sharing time or something where children are encouraged to bring things in. And it doesn't have to be something from home. It could be that you take a walk outside and you say before you go on the walk that we're going to find leaves and we're going to collect leaves on our walk, or we're going to collect acorns or whatever, and they're encouraged then to bring those into the classroom when you get back and explore those and maybe add those to one of your collections of natural objects. So that's another requirement here for ECERS. Totally doable for a young 2-year-old room. Math and number. This was not scored at all in ITERS. So if you have an ITERS room, you need to be intentional about the materials that you have while you transition so that you make sure without too much additional work that you're prepared for this particular item to be scored. So here you would have to have many and varied being 3 to 5 from each type. And there are 5 categories here: counting, measuring, comparing quantities, recognizing shapes, and written numbers. And these are also really pretty simple to get because you probably already have a lot of these materials in one of the other areas. Counting can be books, it can be your calendar. If you're doing any kind of calendar time where you actually count the days, and I see that all the time, it can be numbers, like maybe a number line on the wall that we observe you counting with the kids. It can be like an actual activity, a game, you know. like Candyland, where they have to count the number of squares to progress along that. Measuring would be things like rulers, which you might have as a tool in your art center, a tape measure, which you might have in your dramatic play, like Little Tykes makes a large tape measure that's part of a tool set. Sand timers, I saw a really good example of some sand timers yesterday in the observation I did. There were some really large ones that were 5-minute timers, and there's some smaller ones for 1 minute. Those are great for measuring. Comparing quantities, if you have nesting cups or boxes, nesting boxes, those are used for comparing quantities. Pegs and pegboards, where you can have 2 or 3 pegs in one row and maybe 5 in another. That's another way to compare quantities. Trying to think off the top of my head. I can't remember. Recognizing shapes is a little bit easier too. Maybe if you have a shape sorter, maybe you have a couple different shape sorters. Those would count. If you have the outlines of the blocks on your block shelves, those can count for recognizing shapes. I often see rugs that have shapes on them and numbers. That's another place where written numbers might be, or counting. You might have a poster on the wall or multiple different displays of numbers and shapes. So those are all examples that are math examples, but you probably have already in other materials, so you should not be intimidated by suddenly adding this category, because you don't have to add a whole new interest center. There is no requirement in ECERS that all the math and number materials be kept in one interest center and all of the other fine motor materials be kept in another, and all of the nature and science ones. We see them all mixed all of the time, and I think that that's great. I like to give credit for as many math and number materials in fine motor as I possibly can, and vice versa. So just when you're picking the materials that are going to be freely accessible in the classroom, make sure that they include number and shape and size concepts, and you will have actually already addressed this math and number item.
And can we double dip here and have shape sorters count in 2 areas?
You cannot have them count in 2 areas in math, but they can definitely count as a fine motor material and a math material. You can double dip across items. So something can count like as an accessory for dramatic play, or blocks, I mean blocks, like animals or people, and the animals could count as a toy for nature and science. And pegs and pegboards can count for manipulatives in fine motor and for a math material. But they can't count for counting in math and comparing quantities in math. Any other questions right now?
No.
Okay, wow, I thought we'd have more questions. I'm excited. Okay, so...
Oh, wait.
Spoke too soon.
So I have a very small plant that sits in the window in my classroom. Does that count?
It will count if the children have the opportunity to experience it. So if they can see it, if you talk about what it takes for it to be healthy, or why it sits in the window because it needs sunlight and how often you have to water it and all those things, absolutely it counts. But make sure that they can experience it. We were laughing yesterday when we did the observation because they had 2 plants in the classroom, one of which was toxic and it was labeled, and the other one was dead. So we, as raters, we were training, and we just thought that was funny. They have them there. They've thought about it and planned for it, but they didn't get credit for the one for sure because it was toxic, and we just commented that they need to open the science center and water the plant because it was dying. Okay, we'll move on to, oh, you have another one?
So we have a window bird feeder. Does this count as a living thing to see the birds there all the time?
That's a good question, because that counts in ITERS, but it will not count in ECERS for a living thing, because the living things in ECERS have to be in the classroom. Excuse me. So that's a difference, and that window bird feeder is great. I see those all the time, and it definitely gets credit in ITERS, but it won't in ECERS. But remember that in science, you don't have to have materials in all of those categories. So if you have to have it in 3 of the 4. So if you choose to not have any living things, then all you need to do is make sure that you have 3 to 5 in the other 3 categories, and you're going to be fine. It's not a requirement that you have materials in all 4 of the categories. They only require materials in all categories in fine motor and in math. Otherwise, like for art, it's just 3 to 5 of some of the categories. For nature and science, it's 3 to 5 of some of the categories. So don't stress yourself out and make yourself go to more effort than you have to if you're trying to do this transition from an ITERS to an ECERS environment.
All right, looks like that's all for now.
Okay. The next subscale is interactions, and the only thing that's really different in this subscale is that in ECERS they break out the supervision of gross motor activities, and this particular item is only scored based on the observation of the gross motor activities. And then these are things that we have to observe. We have to observe that staff assist children to develop skills to use equipment. So we would need to see that, if a child is swinging and they don't know how to pump on the swing yet, that maybe you're explaining to them how to do that. Put your legs forward, curl your legs back, whatever. That might be one. Or helping them ride on a tricycle. Maybe helping them learn to use the pedals. Maybe helping them stand up with a scooter and walk. Or maybe catch a ball, something. But we do have to observe that you are assisting the children in developing skills. And then at the 7 level, that staff help with resources to enhance play. So this would be getting something out and setting it up so that a child can use it. And we have to observe this as well. So I've seen things where, teachers set up kind of like an obstacle course, or for riding equipment, it's not so much an obstacle course, but, maybe put out cones and encourage the children to ride like zigzag through the cones. Those are examples of that. Another one that I see regularly with assisting children to develop skills to use equipment is helping a child on a balance beam, a very, very low balance beam and a wide balance beam, especially for this age, but holding their hands and talking about balance while they walk along that. So that is different. That is not scored as an item by itself at all in ITERS. It's included in the general supervision, supervision of play and learning in ITERS. And then here, this is the other big difference, is that for the general supervision of children in ECERS, which sort of translates to the supervision of play and learning in ITERS, it does include supervision of both routines and play. So here we consider, toileting and diapering supervision, meal supervision, and nap supervision, where we do not consider those things at all in the supervision of play and learning in ITERS. They only get considered in those particular personal care routine items. So basically what it boils down to is in ECERS, supervision of personal care routines gets scored twice. Once in the individual specific personal care routine, and again under general supervision. So you want to make sure your supervision is appropriate and warm and supportive of the children all of the time, which I'm sure you're doing. The next subscale is program structure, and this is the last subscale for both of the rating scales. And there's not much that's different. Actually, the 4 items in this subscale are the same by title, except group time. One is called group play activities or something, but basically group. So the big difference here with schedule, or the only thing that really stands out to me that's different from ITERS to ECERS, is that in ITERS there's no requirement that a daily schedule be posted in the classroom for obvious reasons, because what we're looking for in ITERS is that you're individualizing. But in ECERS there's a requirement that there's a daily schedule for the classroom posted inside the classroom, not outside the door in the hallway or anything. It has to be in the classroom. And it has to relate generally to what occurs during the observation. And it has to include times. So it can't just say early morning, mid-morning, late morning, early afternoon, late afternoon. It can't say that. It has to say, you know, 7 till 9 or 7 till 8, 8 till 8:30, whatever, and whatever's happening. And then when we're there doing the observation, we will be writing down, we'll write down the schedule that's posted so that we know what you're planning to do, and then we will write down what we observe as it happens. So if your schedule says that from 7 to 8:30 is free play and 8:30 is breakfast and then 9 o'clock is, you know, brushing teeth or whatever it is, but then we see that they don't have any free play until they come back from playing outside at 10:30 and they never had breakfast at all, nobody ever brought it down. I mean, we would say you might have a schedule posted, but it doesn't relate to what occurs during the observation, and so that would get scored off. And then group time. Group time in ITERS can be scored NA. There's not a requirement that you have a group time, but it's not an option to score an NA in ECERS. So the one thing that I would stress is that you really need to keep whole group gatherings to short periods of time, especially with 2-year-olds. Young 2-year-olds might not be ready for group time at all. And older 2-year-olds still might not really be ready for it, or they might only be ready for about a 3-minute group time. So although we have to score it, there isn't a requirement that you have to have a circle time. Excuse me. So maybe you want to do what I always recommend for ITERS, which is that you offer a group opportunity, like I'm going to sit down and read a story now. Is there anybody who would like to come to the carpet and listen to the story? That's offering it, but not requiring it if you don't make everybody come to the group. And that's a good thing. Or maybe you bring them all to group, say we're all going to sit down and listen to the story, but as children lose interest, you allow them to get up and leave and go access other materials. That's fine too. Just be very, very flexible with it, and don't, just because you're moving into an ECERS environment, don't suddenly put the pressure on yourself and on the children that now we're going to start having the circle time every day from 9 till 9:30, and we're going to do calendar time, we're going to talk about the weather, and I mean that you're going to have 2-year-olds who are tuned out after literally 1 or 2 minutes, and then it will end up getting a low score. So just keep that in mind. That's important. Okay, so here's another reminder. I'm always concerned about this in classrooms that are bridging the gap from ITERS to ECERS, because when you move into the ECERS environment, you're putting in all these materials, and it's easy to forget that, geez, I still have kids in here who are under the age of 3, and 3 is sort of that magic cutoff for a lot of safety hazards. A lot of choking hazards most things aren't choking hazards anymore once a child is 3. So, you know, make sure that the choking hazards that we most commonly find are in art, fine motor, nature, science, and math, and number areas, because they're materials with small pieces. So just make sure that whatever materials you're putting out are appropriate. They're labeled for children that are that age, or they don't have any restriction. So, you know, you wouldn't want to have small Legos in your classroom. But Duplos and Mega Blocks are very appropriate substitutes for Legos. You know, markers, making the adaptation with the marker caps so that they're not accessible to the children, that's a great way to eliminate the safety hazard and still have the material. Other fine motor things I've seen, you know, very small, like pegs and pegboards that are appropriate for older preschoolers, but that somehow end up into a older toddler, young preschool classroom, so maybe some pegs are not appropriately sized. And sometimes magnets or things that you're using with a magnet activity in the Nature Science Center wouldn't be appropriate. So just consider all of those things, and then consider strangulation hazards, which are most commonly found in dramatic play and music areas, things like the belts, ties, scarves, ribbon streamers used in music, those things. Make sure that if they're longer than 12 inches, they need to be shortened or removed. And the best thing I've seen for ribbon streamers then in these classrooms is to take like a shower curtain ring or some kind of ring, a plastic ring, and put smaller sections, like 9-inch sections of ribbon on it, so that it's, you know, it still has some substance, but you don't have to worry about it being really long. And you don't have to have those streamers that are on a long wand that you can probably buy from like Kaplan or something. You can make something that will be appropriate for these young children and not be a strangulation hazard. And then the other areas where I very, very frequently notice safety hazards is in the provisions or furnishings for relaxation where you have stuffed animals. And it's not at all uncommon to find stuffed animals that have labels on them that say that they are not for use by children younger than 3 is the most common, but I also see them for younger than 5 and younger than 6. So make sure that you've looked at the care labels or the tags on your stuffed animals and that they're appropriate for the age of the children in the classroom. And then I also lately have noticed more and more there's puzzles or games that I can't even tell why they're labeled for, you know, not for use by children under 3 because I don't notice any choking hazards with them. But if they're sitting in a box out on the shelf and the box says that, we have to write it down as a safety hazard. So make sure you've double-checked everything. And there's plenty of materials out there to meet the requirements without them being safety hazards. So that was our last section. So if you have, now's the time for all of the questions.
So at what age should we be having group time?
There's not a requirement that you have to have group time, and I, as a formal rater and as an early childhood specialist, even aside from rating, I am not going to say that you should have a group time when kids turn 4 or something like that, because my personal opinion is that group time should be offered but not required, so that children have the opportunity to join. And if you make your group times that are optional very interesting, children will join and stay engaged. But when you require group time, it's much harder. I mean, because there's almost always at least one child that doesn't want to stay attentive. And then that child being forced to stay there usually creates a problem for other children. So in all of the rating scales, no matter what kind you would be using, none of them require a group time for any group of child at a specific age.
And can the library area be used as a cozy area?
Absolutely, and it often is.
And so is it that was the last section, and so we're done except for questions, Rebecca, is that right?
That is right.
So let's just wait a minute for people to process and think if they have any other questions.
Okay.
I was thinking I might check the game score, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to multitask.
No.
I'm in Badgerland, so I'm afraid Russell Wilson is of as great of interest as the Packers here in this area. Kathy, I don't know if that's a typo, but 0 to 0. I don't know what that means. Do you have sand? Do you have to have sand in the sand table?
Oh, as opposed to other sensory materials? I'm assuming that's what that question is.
Mm-hmm.
In ECERS, you can have a sand substitute, but it has to be something that functions like sand. So it has to be scoopable, pourable, measurable. So usually substitutions in a sand table would be things like rice. And I'm not going to get into the whole conversation about food in that, but because rice is one of the things they actually mention in the All About the ECERS book. Other things that could be in there that I see would be like fish tank gravel, dried corn, like field corn that's taken off the cob. Do not, this would be my recommendation, do not put dried beans in there because some dried beans are toxic and you might not know what those are.
The game scores 0 to 0. You guys are cracking me up. Thank you.
Oh, that's what that is.
Can you have mud in the sensory table?
Well, it won't get credited as sand, but you can put it in there. I would be careful with things like that because a lot of young 2-year-olds are still putting a lot of things in their mouths. So I'd be really careful if you have dirt or mud, depending on where you got it. A lot of potting soil that you would buy at the store actually has chemicals like fertilizers and pesticides already in it, and I've noticed that a lot of bags of soil actually are labeled keep out of reach of children. So if you think you're going to put some dirt in your sensory table and you're going to avoid the complications or the potential problems that you might have if you just dug it up from outside, you know, I think you're going to run into different problems because it's going to have chemicals in it. And vermiculite and whatever. And I would say that if you're digging up the dirt from outside and putting it in a sensory table in your classroom, that you're going to probably be bringing in pests that you don't want in your room. I mean, I just wouldn't recommend. I actually did an observation someplace where they had dirt and all the kids were eating it, and I thought it was gross, and it didn't score well because it was a room that was an ITERS room, and I wasn't sure why they had dirt in there, but there's not any prohibition. I just don't think it's going to score well.
And birdseed is a suggestion for the sand table from somebody.
I've seen that before, yes. And I'm just going to say that it's a fine suggestion. Be careful if kids eat it because it will have an impact on their digestive system. There's a reason that bird poop is the way it is.
You're speaking from experience.
Not my own personal experience.
I mean, of kids.
Yes, totally. So.
Cathedra says, ha, ha, ha. I wish we could just unmute you all and have a conversation, frankly.
It'd be a lot of fun,
But
especially with a
more
small
fun.
group.
I know.
We've had such big groups on these webinars that has not been a temptation, but this is a nice group. I have to say the size of this group too, you guys are all probably very serious about bridging this gap and making this transition in a classroom. And if you're listening to this webinar, it's because you really want to provide an environment for these kids who are very high need. This has to be the toughest age, really, going from 2 to 3. And, you know, planning for all of these things. I admire you taking the time on a Thursday evening to pay attention to all of this detail. And with that being said, you'll probably have questions later, and I want to make sure that you feel comfortable reaching out to me or your TC or another formal rater that you might know with some of those questions so that you get them answered.
So what about oatmeal for the sensory table in an ITERS room?
Oatmeal, dry oatmeal?
Gosh,
I'm assuming it's dry oatmeal. Let me just, yes. I mean, I would give credit for that. It's, you know, the authors of the rating scales have a whole thing about being careful about using food for art activities and these other things, and because it sends a mixed message about the value of food, that in this country so many people have so much food that we can literally play with it and throw it in the garbage, and in other countries people are starving and would give anything for a sand table full of dried oats. So I don't really recommend that we use food things, but yes, I would say that dried oats like oatmeal, quick oats, would be a fine substitute in that you can pour it, you can sift it, you can measure it. I think that that's reasonable as a sand substitute.
Melissa says yes, dry oatmeal.
Yes, okay.
Hearing no more questions, not hearing, seeing no more questions. What I'm going to do is go to the next slide, which is the registry information. And, oh, thank you, Bridget. So do we need to be careful with food allergies in terms of food and sensory
I would
tables?
say yes, and my recommendation would be that you are well aware of the food allergies of the children in your classroom, and of course, in addition to considering what food you're serving at meals and snacks, make sure that any other things in the environment are not a potential risk of an allergic reaction.
And Play-Doh is a gluten product, right? Wheat.
I have no idea.
Somebody just told me that who has a gluten allergy, child with a gluten allergy.
I'm sure I ate Play-Doh when I was a child. I ate glue and paste and crayons and all kinds of things, so it wouldn't surprise me, but I wouldn't really know.
So just to clarify, you said manipulatives and math and science can mix and not be very
Absolutely.
defined?
Yes, I mean, I often see in an ECERS classroom that's a more like a 4-year-old classroom, maybe, you know, kids, they might call it a preschool room even, because maybe these are kids who are going to kindergarten next year. I usually in those rooms see more defined interest centers that are specific to math or science. But in young preschool rooms, I often see science materials mixed into a manipulative area. And, you know, a science material, like we identified books, games, and toys, that can be puzzles, and you're probably going to keep your puzzles in your puzzle area, whether they have math, whether they're math focused, like shapes and numbers, or just fun pictures, or a science kind of thing, maybe pictures of animals or the weather. So yes, they can be in different areas.
And you'll still lose points if they eat edible sensory items, correct?
First of all, I would just want to say that you don't get any points for anything and you don't lose any points for anything in the environment rating scales. When we come in and do an observation, it's not like you start with a pool of points and we're taking them away. And you're also not earning points based on your score, like if you score well on something, you don't get 7 points or 10 points for this. So I just want to be clear about that. So we always say something might not score well. So yes, if we observe that a child is eating the contents of the sensory table, regardless whether it's dirt or oatmeal, that's not going to score well. Not actually in the sensory, like in the sand and water item, that's not scored there, but it will be considered in health practices and it will be considered in supervision. Because generally speaking, if kids are eating things they're not supposed to be eating, it's because supervision is not adequate. And so that's why we consider it there. And then obviously we have to consider the health implications if it's something that could be a health hazard. So.
And can we paint with an apple?
You know, that goes back to that whole thing. The authors of the rating scale do not, food is not considered an appropriate art material, number one. So I think what you're talking about is slicing an apple and then doing a print of the inside of the apple. And I've seen that done lots of times. It's not, the apple will not get credited as an art material, number one, and number two, it will be identified on the score sheet under health as not appropriate for that. But you'd have to have some other things there too that aren't appropriate. That by itself isn't going to result in a score of 1. But it's not going to be, it's not considered an appropriate art material.
And Mary says, our TC said that the kids have the right to take things out of the activity area and mix different areas. Do you look at that, or is it okay to have the kids keep things in the area intended? We call the areas stations.
Sure. I mean, I just saw that yesterday in this preschool room where the teacher had very, very clearly defined and specific interest centers, and the science materials stayed at the science center, and the art materials stayed in the art center. And she was really clear about you don't take the toys out of the sand table and put them in the water table or anywhere else. So yes, you can require that they use these materials at this table, for instance, or and we do want to see that block play happens in the block area, and the dramatic play, remember we talked about clearly defined dramatic play area with space to play, that we would expect that the dramatic play materials are going to stay in the dramatic play area, or that if a child walks out of that area with them, that you encourage them to go back into dramatic play, because that's part of what we're looking for, is that it's clearly defined and that has clear boundaries. Same with blocks. But otherwise, taking items, it's very, very common to see a shelf of bins of fine motor materials, whether they include math and nature and science materials, or they're just things like puzzles and Mr. Potato Head and whatever, but that they're stored on a shelf with the understanding that the child takes the bin from the shelf and goes to a table and sits down and uses those materials at the table. That's fine. It's also fine to say, look, these toys that are stored on this shelf by this table have to be used at this table. You can't take them across the room and use them at the art table. That's up to you. That's just for you managing your classroom, and we don't score off for either way that happens.
So sounds like a bit of a conflict between that and a TC saying that kids have the right to take things out of the activity area.
That sounds like a personal philosophy, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but what I'm telling you is how the rating scale scores. So, and I might believe something completely differently, but I have to score what the rating scale says, and there's nothing throughout the entire rating scale that addresses whether or not children are required to play with materials in a specific area, except, like I said, the block area is sort of, you know, enough space to play, and the dramatic play area is clearly defined and with boundaries. Otherwise, there's not anything in the rating scale that says kids either have to stay in an interest center or that they cannot stay in an interest center. They must mix those materials.
So it's 8:01, 8:02. Rebecca, I want you to mention the ERSI Day for providers, and then we're going to switch to the registry credit.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for the reminder. And let me look at my calendar really quickly. Okay, the ERSI Day for providers, it's a public day, Saturday, September the 27th in Pewaukee. It's at a Holiday Inn. I can't remember the address, but this, your TC, I can promise you, has this information. I do someplace else too and would be happy to provide it. But what you need to know is that on Saturday, September the 27th, Debbie Cryer, who is one of the authors of the Environment Rating Scales, is going to be in Pewaukee, and she's going to spend 4 to 5 hours answering questions and explaining the use of the Environment Rating Scales, and that day is specifically set aside for providers, programs, you know, center directors, teachers, owners, family child care providers to come on out and hear her talk about these and ask questions as well. I believe that there's a registration process, so please check with your technical consultant for the specific information, but that's the date, and set it aside if you'd like to be part of that. And if you do come, I'll be there, and so feel free to find me and come up and say hi. Well, and tell me you were on my webinar.
That would be nice to see people, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yes.
All right, so here's the deal with registry credit. First of all, thank you for attending. And I do have one more question somebody asked, so I'm going to do this and then we'll go back to the questions. So what you'll need to do is open up a browser. If you're on your laptop, if you're on your phone, if you're on an iPad, and you need to type this in exactly as it is. And so you need to type in https://www.surveymonkey.com/s/capital ITERS capital ECERS. And so just to make sure that you understand what I mean by typing it into a browser, whoops, better make that clean. I'm hoping you can see this. So I have a new tab up here. You just open a new tab that way, and then you've got this space up at the top. This is Firefox. And so I just have to type this in. It's not a live link. Oops. See, I did this earlier. Hit return or enter, and that will take you to the survey. I'm going to copy this and put it into the chat window too, so that you can see it. I'm going to go back to, actually I'm just going to leave this slide up right now. And so I will leave this slide up with this HTTPS address for the next 30 minutes. So you do need, if you would like to have registry credit, you do need to complete this now. So So just like if it was a face-to-face training, you do need to complete it before you go in order to receive that registry credit. And thank you so much for attending.
Yes.
All right, and I'm going to go back to the questions, Rebecca, and ask this and then type that in because I can't do more than one thing at a time.
Okay.
Do you have to have books in all areas of the classroom?
No. No, there's not a requirement that books be spread around the room, and as a matter of fact, there is a requirement that there be a book center, you know, that books should be organized into a reading center. That does not mean that all books have to be in one area. I often see a reading center or library or whatever you want to call it with, you know, one of those bookshelves that's like stadium kind of seating, you know, where the books sort of stack up. That's typically what I see in a reading area, and then I see maybe in a science center where they'll have some books specifically related to animals or the weather or plants, and then maybe in the dramatic play they might have books about playing house or, you know, something. Sometimes I've seen in the block area some books about trucks and construction. So we don't want to see a lot of that because one of the things we do look for is that books are organized into a reading center. But that doesn't mean that all books are. I would want to make sure that you have one reading center or library area or however you want to call it, and then if you want to put a few other books in a couple other areas to support the learning that takes place in those areas, that's very appropriate.
All right, you're welcome to all the thank yous. I don't see any more questions.
But I do see that Seattle's leading the Packers. Total disappointment. Thanks for the update, though.
Sorry, guys. Go Russell. All right.